Forgotten promises. Oliver Blackwood stared at the quarterly reports on his desk, the numbers blurring before his tired eyes. At 45, he had built Blackwood Technologies into a $4.2 billion empire, yet the corner office on the 63rd floor felt as empty as the day he'd moved in 15 years ago. The soft knock on his door barely registered. "Mr. Blackwood? It's nearly midnight. The car is waiting." "Thank you, Penelope," he said, not looking up from his screen. His assistant lingered in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "Tomorrow's board meeting was pushed to 10. I've updated your calendar." Penelope hesitated. "And, sir?" "That package arrived from storage. I've placed it in your private office as requested." Oliver's fingers stilled over his keyboard. "Thank you. That will be all." After Penelope left, Oliver walked to his private office adjacent to the main one. The box sat innocuously on the coffee table, sealed with yellowing tape. 5 years had passed since he'd ordered everything from his old apartment placed in storage. 5 years of pretending the first 30 years of his life hadn't existed. He sliced through the tape with a letter opener, revealing a collection of photographs, books, and mementos. His hands trembled as he lifted a small velvet box, the engagement ring he never had the chance to give Vivienne Moreau. 12 years. Vivienne had been a brilliant environmental scientist working with Blackwood Technologies on sustainable energy initiatives. Their relationship had been unexpected, the hard-driving entrepreneur and the idealistic scientist, but for 18 months Oliver had known true happiness, until the morning he woke to find her gone. A simple note. "I can't do this anymore. Please don't look for me." Oliver poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and swirled the amber liquid. He'd respected her wishes, channeling his heartbreak into building his company. The years had hardened him into someone unrecognizable, a man whose ruthless business tactics earned him the nickname the Executioner in industry circles. His phone chimed with an email notification. Another acquisition complete, another competitor crushed. The victory felt hollow. Beneath a stack of books, Oliver found a photograph, Vivienne laughing by a lake, sunlight catching in her auburn hair. He remembered that weekend in Vermont, how she'd convinced him to leave his laptop behind, how they'd talked about the future until dawn. "Where did you go?" he whispered to the photograph. The ringing of his phone jolted him from his memories. Unknown number. "Blackwood," he answered curtly. "Mr. Blackwood? My name is Thomas Harrington. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Vivienne Moreau." Oliver's grip tightened on the phone. "Vivienne? What about her?" The pause on the line stretched too long. "I regret to inform you that Ms. Moreau passed away 3 days ago. Pancreatic cancer." The room tilted. Oliver sank into his chair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "That's not possible." "I understand this comes as a shock. Ms. Moreau specifically requested I contact you following her passing. There are matters that require your attention." "What matters?" Oliver asked, his voice hollow. "I believe this is a conversation best had in person. Would you be available to meet tomorrow?" Oliver stared at Vivienne's smiling face in the photograph. "Yes. There's a funeral service tomorrow at 2 o'clock at St. Andrew's Chapel in Fairhaven, Connecticut. Perhaps we could speak afterward." After ending the call, Oliver remained motionless, the scotch untouched. Vivienne was gone. The woman who had once known him better than he knew himself, who had seen beneath his ambition to the man he could have been. Outside his window, New York City glittered, indifferent to his pain. In 12 years, he had never allowed himself to look for her, convinced that respecting her decision was the final act of love he could offer. Now, he was left with questions that could never be answered, or so he thought. The next morning, Oliver canceled all meetings indefinitely, ignoring the panic this caused among his executive team. The drive to Connecticut felt surreal. memories of Vivian surfacing with each passing mile. The small stone chapel came into view, its stained glass windows catching the afternoon sun. Oliver adjusted his tie, a heaviness in his chest unlike anything he'd felt before. He was about to say goodbye to the only woman he had ever truly loved, without ever understanding why she had disappeared from his life. What he didn't know was that inside that chapel waited a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the past 12 years and irrevocably change his future. Revelations at sunset. The chapel stood nestled among ancient oaks, their leaves turning amber in the early autumn light. Oliver remained in his car, watching mourners file inside. Colleagues, friends, people who had shared Vivian's life while he had been absent from it. When he finally entered, he chose a seat in the back row. The service had already begun. A gentle-voiced minister, speaking of Vivian's dedication to environmental conservation and her loving nature. A photograph of her rested beside a simple white casket adorned with wildflowers. Vivian at perhaps 40, her auburn hair shorter than he remembered, laugh lines around her eyes, but unmistakably the woman who had haunted his dreams. She faced her illness with remarkable courage, the minister continued, thinking always of others, especially her beloved children. Oliver's head snapped up. Children? The word echoed strangely in the chapel's hushed interior. His gaze drifted to the front row, where he noticed two teenagers sitting straight-backed beside an older woman. From behind, he could only see the boy's dark hair and the girl's chestnut waves, both reminiscent of Vivian's. The service continued as Oliver's mind raced with calculations. 12 years since Vivian had left. These teenagers looked to be perhaps 16 or 17. The timing was impossible to ignore. When the service concluded, mourners moved toward a reception area. Oliver remained rooted to his seat, watching as the teenagers accepted condolences. When they turned, he felt the air leave his lungs. The boy had Oliver's jawline, his build. The girl had his eyes, the distinctive Blackwood gray that had marked every generation of his family. There was no mistaking what he was seeing. Mr. Blackwood? A middle-aged man in a charcoal suit approached. Thomas Harrington, we spoke on the phone. Oliver barely registered the attorney's presence. Those children... Harrington's expression grew solemn. Perhaps we should speak privately. They moved to a small antechamber off the main chapel. Oliver leaned against the wall, suddenly needing the support. Sophia and Ethan Morgan, Harrington said quietly. 16 years old, twins. Morgan was Vivian's mother's maiden name, Oliver whispered. Yes, she gave them her mother's name. They're mine. It wasn't a question. Harrington nodded. Vivian left specific instructions about contacting you after her passing. She knew her prognosis was terminal 6 months ago. She wanted you to know the truth, but on her terms. Her terms? Anger flashed through Oliver's grief. She kept my children from me for 16 years. She had her reasons, which she detailed extensively. Harrington removed an envelope from his briefcase. This is for you, along with this. He handed Oliver a sealed letter and a USB drive. What is this? Oliver asked. Vivian recorded a message for you. As for the children, she named you in her will as their guardian, should you choose to accept that responsibility. Otherwise, they'll remain with Josephine Winters, Vivian's closest friend, who has been like an aunt to them. Oliver struggled to process this information. Do they know about me? They know their father is alive. They know your name. Beyond that, Harrington hesitated. Vivian was protective of them. She believed your world would be detrimental to them. The knife of those words twisted in Oliver's chest. She thought I would harm my own children? Not intentionally, but the lifestyle, the pressure, the public scrutiny. She wanted them raised differently. Harrington checked his watch. "Ms. Winters is expecting to meet with you. She's taking the children to Vivian's home now. The address is with the documents." Oliver left the chapel in a daze, the letter and USB drive heavy in his pocket. He drove aimlessly along the Connecticut coastline before pulling over at a scenic overlook. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the water. With trembling hands, he connected the USB drive to his laptop and opened the video file. Vivian appeared on screen, seated in what looked like a home office. Her face was thinner than in the funeral photograph, her eyes tired but resolute. She wore a blue scarf wrapped elegantly around her head, concealing hair loss from treatment. "Oliver," she began, her voice slightly raspy, "if you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you know about Sophia and Ethan." She took a visible breath. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Not for the decisions I made, I still believe they were right, but for the pain they must have caused you." She shifted in her seat, wincing slightly. "When I discovered I was pregnant, I was terrified. We had been talking about the future, yes, but your world was becoming all-consuming. The man I fell in love with was disappearing into boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. I watched you cancel our plans for emergency meetings, saw how the gentleness in you was hardening into something colder." He pressed play again. "I made a choice to. I don't know if they'll welcome you into their lives," Vivian concluded. "They're teenagers and they're hurting. But I'm asking you to try, Oliver, not for my sake, but for theirs, and maybe for your own." She leaned closer to the camera. "The man I loved is still in there somewhere. The man who talked about changing the world, not just owning it. Our children deserve to know that man, and he deserves to know them." The video ended, leaving Oliver alone with the sound of waves crashing below. The sun had nearly disappeared now, the last rays illuminating the tear tracks on his face. He started his car and entered the address from Harrington's documents into his GPS. His children, his and Vivian's children, were 17 minutes away. Strangers who carried his blood, his features, perhaps even pieces of who he might have been. As darkness fell, Oliver drove toward a modest colonial house set back from the road, where warm light spilled from the windows and the future he never knew existed waited inside. Letters from yesterday. The colonial house stood illuminated against the deepening twilight, warm light pooling beneath the windows. Oliver sat in his car, engine off, gathering courage. Inside were two teenagers who shared his DNA but knew nothing of him, except perhaps what Vivian had chosen to tell them. Finally, he approached the front door and knocked. Footsteps sounded from within, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s, with dark curly hair and kind, albeit wary eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I'm Josephine Winters. Please come in." The living room was cozy, filled with books and framed photographs. Evidence of a life well lived. Vivian's life, from which he'd been excluded. "The children are upstairs," Josephine said, gesturing for him to sit. "They know you're coming, but—" She hesitated. "This is difficult. For them." "Of course," Oliver replied, perching awkwardly on an armchair. "It's difficult for me, too." Josephine studied him. "Vivian said you would come. Even after all these years, she knew you." Before Oliver could respond, footsteps descended the stairs. The twins entered the room together, a united front. The chapel. He'd glimpsed them from a distance. Now, seeing them up close, stole his breath away. Sophia had Vivian's delicate features but his height and slate-gray eyes. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple black dress that made her look older than her 16 years. Ethan was almost as tall as Oliver, with the same broad shoulders and strong jawline, but he had Vivian's expressive mouth and thoughtful gaze. "Hello?" Oliver said, his voice catching. I'm We know who you are, Ethan interrupted, his tone carefully neutral. You're Oliver Blackwood. Sophia remained silent, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Yes, Oliver managed. I just learned about you today. Both of you. Mom said you didn't know, Sophia spoke finally. She said it was her choice, not yours. Oliver nodded, grateful for Vivian's honesty on this point at least. That's true. Had I known... What? Ethan challenged. You would have been part of our lives, the great Oliver Blackwood taking time from conquering the business world to attend school plays? Ethan, Josephine cautioned. Oliver faced his son's anger directly. I don't know what I would have done. I can't rewrite the past. But I'm here now, and I would like to know you both. An uncomfortable silence fell. Sophia shifted her weight, studying Oliver with an analytical gaze that reminded him painfully of Vivian. Mom left something for you, she said finally. Besides the video, there's a box, Josephine explained. Vivian prepared it during her last months. She asked that we give it to you after you'd met the children. She left the room and returned with a weathered wooden chest about the size of a shoebox. Oliver accepted it with reverence, knowing it contained Vivian's final communication to him. We have homework, Ethan announced abruptly, and you probably have companies to buy or something. The dismissal was clear. Oliver rose, clutching the box. I'll be staying at the Harborview Inn for a few days. I'd like to see you again if you're willing. Sophia's expression softened slightly. Maybe. We need time. Of course, Oliver said. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As he drove to the hotel, the wooden box beside him seemed to pulse with unspoken truths. In his room, he finally opened it to find dozens of sealed envelopes, each dated and addressed to him in Vivian's flowing script. The earliest was marked 12 years ago, just weeks after she'd left. With trembling hands, he opened the first letter. My dearest Oliver, I'm writing this from a small apartment in Burlington, Vermont. I'm 16 weeks pregnant, and this morning I felt our babies kick for the first time. Yes, babies. Twins, the doctor says. I cried when I heard their heartbeats. Wishing you were beside me, I keep asking myself if I've made the right choice. Last night I saw you on the financial news. Your company had just acquired Reynolds Tech. You looked triumphant but exhausted, those shadows under your eyes that appeared whenever you worked too hard and slept too little. I remembered the Oliver I met 2 years ago, the man who talked about changing the world, not just owning pieces of it. I want our children to know that man, not the titan of industry who cancels dinners for emergency board meetings, not the man whose gentle heart was hardening into something cold and calculating with each new victory. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Perhaps you would have changed everything for these babies. But the night before I left, you took a call during our anniversary dinner, a dinner you had already rescheduled twice. You spoke for 40 minutes about profit margins while our meal grew cold, and I realized I had become secondary to your ambition. I cannot let that happen to our children. They deserve to be someone's priority. I love you, Oliver. I will always love you. But I love these tiny lives inside me more. Vivian Oliver read letter after letter as night deepened around him. Some were brief updates about the twins' development, their first words, first steps, school achievements. Others were deeper reflections on parenthood, on Vivian's occasional doubts, on her terminal diagnosis. Together, they formed a chronicle of the life he had missed, a parallel existence that had been unfolding while he built his empire of glass and steel. In one letter, dated 8 years ago, Vivian wrote, Sophia asked about you today. What's my daddy like? She wanted to know. I told her you were brilliant and determined, that you could see solutions where others saw only problems. I showed her your picture from a business magazine. He looks serious, she said. Does he ever laugh? I told her you used to laugh all the time. especially at my terrible jokes. I want them to know the real you, Oliver, not just the businessman the world sees." By dawn, Oliver had read through half the letters, his heart breaking anew with each revelation. He finally slept for a few hours, then woke determined to make contact with his children again. He called Josephine, who agreed to ask the twins if they would meet him for lunch. To his surprise, they accepted. At a waterfront restaurant, the conversation was stilted at first. Ethan remained guarded, while Sophia observed Oliver with curious intensity. "Mom kept journals about you," Sophia said suddenly, breaking a silence. "About how you met. What you were like together." Oliver set down his fork. "Did she?" Sophia nodded. "She said you took her sailing on your first date even though there was a storm warning." Despite himself, Oliver smiled at the memory. "The weather report said 20% chance of rain. I calculated those were acceptable odds. She said you got completely drenched but insisted it was merely atmospheric moisture." Sophia's impression of his formal speaking style was surprisingly accurate. "That sounds like him," Ethan muttered, the first hint of humor he'd shown. "Your mother," Oliver began carefully, "was the most alive person I've ever known. She made me see the world differently." "She said the same about you," Sophia offered. Before I changed," Oliver finished. "Before the business became everything." Ethan studied him. "Is that why you're here now? Guilt?" "I'm here because you're my children," Oliver answered honestly. "I've missed 16 years of your lives. I don't want to miss any more." "We're almost adults," Ethan pointed out. "In less than 2 years, we'll be in college. Then I have less than 2 years to get to know you before that happens," Oliver replied. "If you'll let me." Sophia exchanged a glance with her brother. "Mom wanted us to give you a chance. But we're not moving to New York," Ethan added firmly. "Our lives are here." Oliver nodded, understanding the implicit boundary. "I was thinking I might stay in Connecticut for a while. My company has offices in New Haven." "You would do that?" Sophia asked, surprised. "I would." The decision, made in the moment, felt surprisingly right. "I have excellent executives who can manage day-to-day operations in New York." As lunch concluded, the twins seemed slightly more relaxed. They agreed to meet again the following day. That evening, he returned to Vivian's letters, finding one that contained a photograph he'd never seen. Vivian holding newborn twins in a hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. On the back, she had written, "Sophia Grace and Ethan Oliver, our greatest collaboration." Oliver traced his son's name with his finger, overwhelmed by the knowledge that despite everything, Vivian had given their son his. Building bridges. The small office in New Haven felt nothing like Oliver's sleek Manhattan headquarters. No floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, no original artwork adorning the walls, just a functional space where he could maintain essential operations while staying near the twins. 3 weeks had passed since Vivian's funeral. 3 weeks of cautious meetings with Sophia and Ethan, each encounter a delicate dance of discovery and restraint. Oliver had rented a modest house on the outskirts of Fairhaven, close enough to the twins, but not so near as to feel intrusive. His phone rang. Penelope, his assistant, calling from New York. "The board is requesting your presence at Friday's quarterly meeting," she said. "Henderson is particularly insistent." Oliver glanced at his calendar. Friday was Ethan's music recital, the first event his son had explicitly invited him to attend. "Tell them I'll join virtually," he replied. "I have a prior commitment." "Sir, they specifically mentioned the Chen acquisition." "The acquisition can wait," Oliver interrupted, surprising himself with his certainty. "Family can't." The word family hung in the air after he ended the call. Was that what they were becoming? The twins remained guarded, but small openings had appeared in their armor. Sophia sharing her marine biology research paper, Ethan reluctantly admitting that Oliver's suggestions on his college application essay were helpful. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Josephine stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Josephine," Oliver said, rising from his desk, "is everything all right?" "The twins." "They're fine," she assured him. "I was in New Haven for a meeting and thought—" She held up a paper bag. "I brought lunch, if you're not busy." Over sandwiches from a local deli, they sat across from each other, the initial awkwardness gradually easing. "The twins mentioned you're coming to Ethan's recital," Josephine said. Oliver nodded. "I wouldn't miss it. Apparently he's performing an original composition." "He is. It's beautiful, written for Vivian during her last months." Josephine studied him. "It means something that he invited you." "I know," Oliver said quietly. "I'm trying not to read too much into it." Josephine smiled. "You're different than I expected." "Different from what Vivian told you?" "Different from your public persona." She brushed crumbs from her lap. "Vivian always insisted there were two Oliver Blackwoods, the ruthless CEO and the man she fell in love with." Oliver felt a familiar pang. She wasn't wrong. "The twins see it too," Josephine continued, "especially Sophia. She's been reading about your renewable energy initiatives." This surprised him. "Has she?" She mentioned that the real-world applications align with her marine conservation interests." Josephine gave him a knowing look. "You might consider discussing it with her." Later that afternoon, Oliver visited Vivian's house, now legally his, though he had no intention of claiming it. The twins still lived there with Josephine, maintaining the only home they'd ever known. He'd been gradually sorting through Vivian's belongings, a process both painful and strangely intimate, discovering the life she'd built without him. In the garden, he found the rose bush she'd mentioned in her final letter. It's late season. Blooms were a deep crimson, reminiscent of the dress she'd worn when they first met. Following her instructions, he carefully took a cutting to transplant at his rental house. As he worked, Sophia appeared beside him, observing his technique. "Mom was better at this," she said. "She could make anything grow." "She certainly could," Oliver agreed, thinking not just of plants, but of the family she'd nurtured alone. "I was never much for gardening." "So what are you good at?" Sophia asked, the question more curious than challenging. Oliver considered. "This. Solving problems, seeing patterns, building things. Mom said you built your first computer when you were 12. 11, actually," he corrected with a small smile. "It barely functioned." Sophia knelt beside him, helping to secure the cutting. "I read about your company's marine plastic reclamation project, the one in Indonesia." "You did?" She nodded. "The polymer conversion technology is impressive." Oliver saw an opening. "We're expanding the initiative to 3 more locations. I could show you the research if you're interested." "I'd like that," Sophia said, then added almost shyly, "Maybe I could show you my research too, on microplastic filtration in bivalves." "I'd be honored," Oliver replied, meaning it. That evening, over dinner at his rental house, the first time, the twins had visited. The conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Ethan described his music program at school, while Sophia enthusiastically explained her science project. Oliver listened, asking questions, discovering these remarkable young people who somehow carried pieces of both himself and Vivian. After dinner, Ethan noticed the grand piano in the corner of the living room. "You play?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I used to," Oliver admitted. "Not for many years now." "Mom said you were good." "Your mother was being kind. I was adequate at best." Ethan approached the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys. "Would you mind if I—" Please, Oliver encouraged. What happened next left Oliver speechless. Ethan's fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity and emotion that transcended technique. The piece began softly, almost hesitantly, then built in complexity and passion. Oliver recognized elements of classical structure interwoven with more contemporary influences, all serving a melody that seemed to tell a story without words. When Ethan finished, the final notes lingering in the air, Oliver found himself unable to speak. "That's his piece for Mom," Sophia explained quietly. "The one he's playing Friday. It's extraordinary," Oliver managed finally. "You're extraordinarily talented, Ethan." For the first time, Ethan accepted Oliver's praise without skepticism. "Thanks." As the evening concluded, Oliver felt a shift in the atmosphere, a tentative warmth that hadn't been there before. The next day, Oliver received an unexpected visitor at his office. Josephine arrived unannounced, her expression troubled. "Josephine, what's wrong?" "Ethan had a difficult night," she explained. "He found more of Vivian's journals, ones she wrote during her treatment." Oliver's heart sank. "I see. He's angry again, at the situation, at losing her, at you, for not being there during her illness." Josephine sat heavily in the chair opposite his desk. "I thought you should know before Friday." "Thank you for telling me." Oliver paused. "Should I give him space?" "Actually, I think the opposite might be better. He needs to see that you won't disappear at the first sign of difficulty." She studied him. "That's what he expects, you know. That when things get hard, you'll return to your real life in New York." The words stung because they held truth. For years, Oliver had retreated from emotional complications into the clear, controlled world of business. "New York isn't my real life anymore," he said quietly. "This is." Josephine's expression softened. "I believe you mean that today. But meaning it when Ethan is shouting at you, or when your board is demanding your return, or when the twins make choices you don't agree with, that's the test." "A test I intend to pass," Oliver said firmly. That afternoon, he went to Vivian's house, finding Ethan in the backyard, aggressively splitting firewood. The boy's face was flushed with exertion and emotion. "Josephine told me about the journals," Oliver said, approaching cautiously. Ethan brought the axe down hard, splitting a log cleanly. "She shouldn't have." "I'd like to talk about it if you're willing." "What's to talk about?" Ethan demanded, setting up another log. "Mom was dying, and you weren't here." "I didn't know," Oliver reminded him gently. "That's the point." Ethan swung the axe again. "You didn't know because you weren't part of our lives, because your precious company was more important." Oliver absorbed the accusation, recognizing the grief beneath the anger. "You're right that I made choices I regret, but I'm here now and I'm not leaving." Ethan scoffed. "Until something more important comes up." "Nothing is more important than you and Sophia." Oliver stepped closer into Ethan's space. "Nothing." Something in his tone made Ethan pause, axe mid-swing. For a long moment, father and son regarded each other, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. "She was in pain," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking. "At the end. She tried to hide it, but we knew." Oliver felt his own eyes filling. "I wish I could have been here. For her. For both of you." Ethan lowered the axe. "She didn't want you to see her like that. It's in the journals. She wanted you to remember her how she was." The revelation pierced Oliver's heart, one final act of protection from Vivian, sparing him the pain of watching her fade. "Your mother was the strongest person I've ever known," Oliver said. "And that strength lives in you, Ethan. I hear it in your music." Ethan wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Are you really coming on Friday?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Oliver promised. Friday evening arrived, the school auditorium filling with parents and students. Oliver sat beside Sophia and Josephine, acutely aware of the curious glances from those who recognized the notorious CEO in their midst. This piece is called Echoes of Autumn. I wrote it for my mother during her final season with us. The music began, even more powerful than when Oliver had heard it in his home. As the melody built and evolved, Oliver felt Vivian's presence in the bittersweet transitions, the Emmy,